Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wild Roof Journal's podcast episode with Kelly Gray. So we'll get a little bit of an intro from Kelly to start things off. Kelly, you've been on the podcast once before, and you've been a contributor to Wild Roof Journal in most recently our issue number 21 from July. So if you would just introduce yourself a little bit, who you are, why you're here. You can take it from there.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and be a part of Wild Roof Journal. Yeah, I really appreciate it. So I am a writer. I do poetry quite a bit, but also creative nonfiction and fiction. And I live in Northern California on Coast Miwok and Kashaya-Pomo land, right at the border of those two traditional lands. And I'm here today because I have a new chapbook that was just released from Tusculum Review called The Mating Calls of a Spectre. And it is a chapbook that feels very dear to my heart. It took me 2 years, although it's quite short, it took me 2 years to write. So that's what I've been up to lately.
All right, cool. Maybe just as an entry point, just to get a little sense of like, how did you come to writing? How did you come to creative writing? Were you a creative person from the start of things? Did you come to it in a kind of winding path kind of way?
Yeah, I think that maybe all of the above applies to me. Because I think when we're writing, there's so many different ways we can engage with writing and engage with the world reading our writing. So when I started writing, I was someone who was learning how to write and learning how to read. I was really young and I was compelled to write stories. I still remember my first story was very dramatic and had little cute illustrations with it. And as I entered my preteen and teenage years, I was pretty prolific with it, but it was something that was very private to me, although my family knew that I did it and had encouraged me to apply for this writing program we have in California through CalArts, which I did only because my grandfather asked me to do it. I didn't really want to go. You had to travel I live in Northern California, and I had to go to Southern California for it. And I, for some reason, was accepted into this program and ended up leaving and going there and had this experience that really marked who I am as a writer, which was I was sharing my poetry with the student body, and they had a really negative reaction to it. And I was writing about things that were, I think now would probably teens would not blink an eye at, but then was definitely deemed inappropriate for a young lady to be writing about. And they circulated a petition. They didn't want me in the program anymore. And I was a pretty sensitive kid. This was not the reaction that I anticipated. It wasn't an easy reaction for me. It didn't make me feel validated in my writing at that point. And I left having the distinct feeling that I didn't want to share my work anymore because I had this really horrible reaction to it. And that stayed with me for decades. And I'm 46 now. I'm asking myself, am I 46? I'm at the age where you forget how old you are. And it wasn't until 39 or 40 that I really woke up with this urge to share my writing again and seek publication. And once I decided I wanted to do that, I had to figure out how to do that, which was a different relationship with writing, because then it was like, well, okay, I write, but now I want to be published. And that's very different, as you know. And so it's been really wonderful sharing my work and feeling like I'm at a place in my life where I don't have to be responsible for other people's feelings about it. But it took me a really long time to get there. Sometimes I wonder, what if I had had someone that was mentoring me, that could have walked me through that initial experience? What if the adults in that scenario had been more responsible in facilitating a conversation? Who knows? But I also think that much of my writing that existed between that time and getting to my 40s maybe wasn't really meant for the world anyway, that my views on the world weren't as formed as I would want them to be. So yeah, so that's how I came to writing. I don't have any formal training. I don't come from an academic background with it. I just really did wake up one day and was like, oh, I want to be published, and then tried to do it. I'm still trying to do it.
That's an interesting path in itself, but maybe we can just pause for a moment on like that maybe that initial scene, like if we're kind of like sketching out like the movie of your lifestyle, like the scene of like getting a negative reaction, like especially at that young age and that kind of formative experience. Because on the flip side, many people, whatever it is, doing something creatively or just kind of taking a step out of their comfort zone, a lot of times there is like maybe a story of like having that initial, just it's called like maybe beginner's mind or some beginner's luck. Sometimes they call it, say, oh, I just first gallery show and I sold something. Look at that. And then like that could get you hooked and just happenstance of feedback. But
I had the
getting
opposite
something on
experience.
the opposite.
It was
And
like,
you,
be quiet. That was the loud and clear message that I got.
yeah, but I mean, just the importance of that, and even you um, acknowledge it. It took you a long time to just work through that and be more in a place of stepping back from it and say, yeah, whatever, whatever the reaction is, that's fine. But I mean, do you recall, like, was it a conscious thing where you said, this isn't for me anymore? Or is it just something that
Oh,
kind of
I
gets
was
pushed
terrified.
aside?
It
Or
was very
yeah,
much conscious. I mean, I was absolutely terrified of the reaction. It very much marked the way that I thought about writing, which was, I'm going to have a negative reaction to this. I will also share the second time that my work was shared. Also, as a teenager, I was living in a foster home in Montana, and I was 17 years old, and I was in a public high school English class, very small. This was a very small town in rural Montana. There was 200 children in kindergarten through senior year. So there was 25 kids in my senior class, just to paint the picture. And as a kid from California, I definitely stood out. And my English teacher, we had a pretty good relationship. And I think that he recognized that I took writing seriously. And he took an essay that I had written about, an argumentative essay on whether I was arguing for a bill that was being passed in Montana. I forget the bill number, but it was for censorship or against censorship. And of course, my essay was against censorship. And I used LGBTQ rights as the foundation of my essay. And he liked the essay enough that he submitted it to the local newspaper to be printed, but he didn't tell me that that was happening. And the community that we lived in did not, the majority opinion was not on the side that I was taking at all. And so I arrived in school one day to discover that everyone had read this essay, and teachers were furious at me, not just teasing, but threatening. And I called my foster mom, Sherry, up and said, you have to come get me. I don't feel safe here at all. And I was in tears, and she came and got me. And I still remember the conversation in the parking lot. She said, whether you write or whether you just want to be true to yourself, you're going to have to get used to this. This is the reaction you're going to get. And you're only getting this reaction because you're doing it well. And that, although I still had that terror, and that terror stayed with me of that reaction, I think I took to heart what she said, and I ended up becoming a community organizer for decades, and I was really focused on telling other people's stories and how to support people in telling their stories. But it just took me that long to turn it on myself. And so that was really like the realization that I had. But just to answer your question very simply, yes, it was very much a voice that was like, don't do that. That's so scary. Don't do that.
Wow. Yeah.
And I don't write
That's
anything
something.
just to say, like, I don't consider myself writing anything like particularly radical now.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess it depends on where you're at and the perspective that you're taking with it. But once you're told that your writing or your stories are powerful enough to have people, like, to elicit anger, for instance, that can really impact you when you're a young person. I teach now in the schools. I'm a poetry teacher for elementary to high school age kids. Um, and I think I probably ended up there because I want to do some of that healing work for other people still.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, you can't really overstate the importance of that kind of support, encouragement, when a student or adult or whoever has something that they care enough to share or put out there. I can, speak for myself. If I share something and get a good reaction, like it feels good. It makes me want to do it more.
Totally.
So it just kind of taps into that sense of that belonging and community and just everything that goes into those things that run so deep. That's kind of, yeah, that's interesting. And
Kind of dangerous too, right? Like that idea that that feel that, there's nothing that will make my day more than getting an acceptance letter or a kind rejection letter. Either one. I'll take either one. And
yeah,
and I have to really check myself on that because I still think that's external validation. And yes, we're in a community and we know that that's our access to share our work, right? Publication to me is just like a way to be able to not burden my friends reading all my work, right? It's just like getting it out there to a larger audience and being a part of a conversation. But I worry sometimes about how much I want that or seek that. And I worry the same for other poets in the community as well.
yeah, that's always a good consideration or question. I think if just off the top of my head, like it's maybe a fine line, or I don't know if you can always make a, hard distinction, but it's like as a writer or creator of anything, like when you let the response or the anticipated reaction like affect what you're creating or what you're putting out there, that is usually just kind of, speaking to people and getting a sense of that process. Like that's kind of the distinction of like, okay, I did it. I'm putting it out there. It feels good if I get a good response, as opposed to I'm doing something I think is going to get the response I want and then
Right.
putting it out there. It's always there, but yeah, I think just in that clean sense and just genuinely like I created this in that way and it's out there. Yeah, of course. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong to like feel good about that
Yeah.
kind of sense of validation or acceptance or whatever it is. That's, it's a sign that you're being heard. That's always going to feel good, that you're heard. And even if it isn't, this is the greatest thing ever, it's accepted, it won an award or something, but just it's acknowledged, it's heard, you're part of this process going on. And even you can think of it in that way. Yeah, I wrote down the need for a mentor. I think that's like, and just to acknowledge that point too, like how important that process is, maybe even in adolescence, young adulthood, beyond. That's always something I think that can be helpful. But yeah, maybe we can touch on your new chapbook, Mating Calls of a Spectre. Was there any particular distinction of the writing process for these poems? You mentioned it took a couple of years in the making.
Mhm.
Was it just a collection that came together? Was it more of an organized process?
Yeah, it kind of started as something that was organized, then fell apart, then came back to being very organized. It started as a collection that I was exploring about murder ballads and actually had a completed chapbook around that, but something was not sitting right with me about it. Like I really felt a discomfort about the harm that was taking place on the page. And I also felt that there was a voice that was starting to develop that I needed to spend more time with. So I kind of really did a major revision where I just took out so many of the poems and just trashed them. And then realized that what I was left with was someone who wanted to interact with, well, basically, I'll just say what the book is about. The book is about a young woman who wakes up, who is waking up to being a ghost for the first time. And she's starting to realize that across this rural landscape out through the fields, she can see her town and the house she grew up in and the school that she went to. And there's this draw, this pull that's pulling her back to haunt the town and the people that participated in her demise. And so the book is very much about memory and how memory lives in our body and the things that will pull us back. And it's also about really about rape culture and how many small moments can make up a death of a person or parts of a person. Um, and in the book, there is not any, there's a lack of graphic depictions of murder or rape. That is not in this book. And that was really important to me. And I think that that's where a lot of the time went into is how do you talk about something like that without actually repeating harm on the page? For sure, someone could read this and it could be triggering for them or bring up memories and double down on harm. So acknowledge that there is a content warning with this chap. But once I started to see the voice and hear this person and let her be in the lead of creating the world, then the chapbook just kind of came together as a whole. And I really feel like it's like, like I get it, I wrote it, but I felt like it was really giving over to this other voice and letting her lead the way.
Something that came through like a character, is that something you've worked with before a lot? Or I mean, like almost in
Not
that
in
kind of
poetry.
fictional realm?
Yeah, well, exactly. So not in my poems. For sure, there's some poems that maybe bring out a little bit more of like maybe like a little hidden persona that I have or something like that. But no, this was very much a character that was developed like I would within a short story. So this is the first time that I just wrote to a character in poetry.
Yeah, that's interesting too, and it gives it that kind of narrative arc aspect of a collection, which each individual poem may be able to stand alone by itself, or at least some of them would be, but
I don't
then
think they
as
can
a whole.
actually.
Oh, really?
It, yeah, when I was working with Tusculum Review is the publisher, and they were really wonderful. And it was selected for their chapbook prize by Justin Philip Reed. And when I was talking to the editors and we were putting together a reading for it, one of the challenges that we all felt is like, we have a limited amount of time. How do we pick and pull poems out of this? Because they very much they work within that narrative arc. And because of that, I had never submitted them individually to, usually I try to, vet my poem or see if my poems can get vetted by someone else before they reach collection stage. But I did not do that with this chapbook because I couldn't see them outside of each other.
Yeah, so that maybe does lend itself more to like a story format where you can't exactly take, chapter 8 and listeners read this and you'll get
Yeah.
it. Yeah, so that is an interesting twist on that. One thing out of the poems that I've encountered of yours, I love the titles. I think I mentioned that when I spoke to you previously. Is that something that you have a title first, a title last? Do you have like a notebook where you just write down a list of that's an interesting phrase, that's a title, that's something that you're conscious of? Because they are attention getting.
I think that I try not to limit myself with the title. I'm like, if it needs 2 lines, it needs 2 lines, and that's not always easy, because when you're trying to write a bio with these long titles, I'm like, oh my God, like, can I calm it down for a second? But yeah, no, sometimes I have a title where I'm like, I need to write a poem for this title and see what comes of it. And that can act as a prompt, it
Yeah,
can
yeah.
get me creative. But usually I think what happens is I have a first line or a line somewhere in the poem that I'm like, this is not fitting, this is not right. And I'm like, bump it to the title, see if that works. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think that's often where they come from.
Yeah, nice. So yeah, side note, your poem, The Everlasting Eulogy of Lush, which was issue 8, going back to the archives of Wild Roof Journals. That was one specific example I'll throw out there. Maybe one offshoot to that is like you mentioned, like a line maybe not working, and you think of it in maybe different places, right? Opening line, closing line, title, like you mentioned. Are there places in your creative process where you've hit the wall, gotten stuck, hit a block? The chapbook that you just mentioned, you said it fell apart and came back together again. So, there's something going on there. So do you tend to have a plan in place or something like that? Not to make it too formulaic or anything, like when something just isn't working, or you just feel like, yeah, I got that idea over there and I haven't touched it for a while, and you just feel that resistance to go back to it. Any like experience like that come to mind specifically, or through the last book writing process?
Yeah, it's a really good question. When I think my blocks come up in 2 ways. One is when I have an idea and I don't know how to do it, or I'm feeling self-conscious. And that block usually comes from how I imagine the perception being of the finalized product. And so I'm too much for, and I recognize, I try to get to the point where I'm like, oh, you're thinking too much about the end product. Stop that. It's like really like a self pep talk, like just try to do the mechanics of writing and just really try, like, what is it you're trying to say? Just say that. Don't worry about how it's going to sound to someone else. Just say what you want to say. So there's like that. And then I think also there's blocks where I don't necessarily have a project or a poem that I'm thinking of. And I just feel like I should write, but I'm not writing. And I don't know what to write. And that can be really maddening sometimes, because I know that when I write, I feel better about myself and I can process and grow. And so I'm like, come on, like there's growth. Like you should be growing right now and you're not, right? Um, and and sometimes I think that that's because I'm like physically stuck and I need to like go out on a walk. And so I will take a pad and paper or a device or something out with me and just walk around in the woods and see what I can see and start writing as my body is moving. And I find that to be really helpful. But I also have a fundamental belief that we're writing all the time, even when we're not putting words on paper or screen, whatever it may be. And I try to remind myself that just living and being engaged in relationships, or like the act of washing the dishes, or just like having to go to work or whatever, that's all feeding the eventual poem. And that if I can just like let myself off the hook a little bit and experience life, that usually feels better to me. So like right now, I haven't written for a while because the collection, just came out, and I always feel like more pressure after that to produce something. And so I'm just like, you don't have to right now. So I guess I'm saying just embrace the block, just be with the block and sit in it.
And I think too, there is maybe a difference between not writing yet being having an awareness or an attentiveness to your whatever your day to day, which maybe seems mundane or whatever, just the routine, but maybe going through that routine with that attentiveness, let's say, versus just being tuned out, or just being totally kind of overwhelmed or stressed.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there is something there, because you'll notice next once in a while during one of those mundane commutes, or sitting around waiting in your car in a parking lot or something, then a poem strikes all of a sudden, right? And where did that come from exactly? So I think there is that nice balance of not being too pressurized to write, but also not totally being disconnected from it either. Do you have any tricks of the trade? I guess we maybe mentioned one of them, like moving a line to different parts of the poem. Anything that came to mind in terms of like even just kind of a writing trick that you have in your bag?
A writing trick. Well, I definitely like to, when I feel like I'm getting close to, I should start by saying I like revising work as much as I like writing it, if not more. Um, and there's this point that's a little hard to say, oh, this is exactly when you do this, but recording my work and hearing myself read it is incredibly illuminating every time. And I'll catch things that I just won't catch otherwise. Having a trusted person who knows your work and knows your intention with your work that you can send it to. And I mean, outside of a workshop that you're taking with people you don't know, I mean, outside of maybe a friend who doesn't write, I mean, like another trusted writer who can say, oh, hey, look at this, look at this, look at this. And it doesn't even to me matter if I agree with what they're saying. It's just another way to get to know the work a little bit more. I highly recommend that. And then also, I'm someone who will often switch from, I'll take a poem that's prose and then lineate it, or vice versa, quite a bit to mess with line breaks. And so sometimes I'll have, like upwards of 10 versions of something just messing with line breaks. And it's funny because I should, like a confession, this is not a trick. I do not recommend doing this to anyone, but I compulsively will submit work before I'm like 100% done with it. But I think in the moment that I'm done with it, but then if I would actually like step back, I'd be like, you were not done with that. Why did you submit that? And sometimes those actually are I have noticed that sometimes those get picked up more. And so it's interesting because I'm trying to learn when I think there's something that can be really, a little messiness is okay, I guess is what I'm saying. And sometimes I think editors pick up on that and they're like, or not pick up on that, but appreciate that and find that beauty in it, and that you can make it too neat and take some of the original chaos out of it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's not the worst. I mean, you didn't label this as advice, but it's not the worst advice. Maybe in six poems that you're submitting, one of them is maybe a new one that you're not fully settled on. Just, what the heck? It's worth maybe that kind of approach to it once in a while.
I mean, do you
Um,
feel with your writing that you can get to a point where a poem could not be revised anymore? Because I don't know that I reached that point really. I feel like I could always continue to shape and mold in some ways.
yeah, and I mean the trick is to, if that's considered a trick, to, yeah, just to kind of like let it go. I mean, could it be revised more? Of course, but I guess there's ones that I'm just good with the way the way they ended up, and that's the way they ended up.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, definitely, if you allow it, you could definitely find some changes to be made, even the ones that were published before, for sure.
Yeah.
There is that element of like knowing when it's ready just to step away from, and that doesn't mean it's perfect, and that's a different task. I always like to include a little bit of practicality in some of these, so
Yeah.
I think we got a little bit to chew on. So yeah, maybe you could read one of your poems from your new chapbook, "The Mating
Thank,
Calls of a Spectre."
thank you so much. Just to give this a little context, this is the narrator who is in ghost form, is in the process right now of she's come back into town. She's seen her home that she grew up in, and she's taking her first journey out into the town in ghost form. Parade day. I pull the dress from the closet, the rose one that hitches knicker level. Pretty girl I coo. Mama porch drunk and screen door slap. A fly jumps. I walk myself to the cows. A rope for calf neck rolls in my hand as I watch a truck bed handsome man part a crowd to choose me, dead girl. The calf nuzzles deep pocketfuls of buttercup smashed into the smell of a field. When the last ballad is sung up through the bar, like the call of a thick throated dog, I drop through the back door and shimmy down a damasked hallway marked with smoke. My stumble, a wail in return, my bird song call in the mouth of a coyote.
Thank you. Excellent. So where would somebody go to get your book?
They would Google Tusculum Review, and that'll just bring you to Tusculum Review. And then you can, I think it's right now on their homepage, The Mating Calls of a Spectre chapbook, and you can buy it as a chapbook. It's a limited edition, or if you buy their current edition, it's included within that, but not as its own chapbook. So like you just kind of open it up and it's within there, within everything else. But love when people buy it on its own. That is great.
Yeah, awesome. And then your website, your writer website is writegray, GRAY.com.
Yeah,
So you have
right K Gray at Gmail.
Write K Gray. That allows somebody to get some of the poems that have been published previously that you have links to, so you can get a sense of your style. So we can kind of close it out with that poem. So thank you again for joining me and offering your selection. We'll have links to your stuff, your website, and chapbook on the podcast page, so you could head there. Otherwise, I'll talk to you soon. Good night.
Good night, Aaron. Thank you so much.